Everyone has heard of King John, the tyrant forced to go to war with his barons, leading to the signing of the Magna Carta. People probably know him from Robin Hood or other Hollywood productions. But I'm not here to delve into the realms of mythology, hearsay, or legend. My mission is to unveil the man behind the myth. Who was King John? Before I can truly get into that, I will have to paint you a picture. For England was just emerging from a time of turmoil. The Civil War, known as the Anarchy, was still fresh in living memory, having only finished 13 years prior. Empress Matilda was still alive. During this bitter struggle between her and Stephen, her son Henry Fitz-Empress became a dominant figure, emerging from the stalemate as the son of an empress and the adopted son of a king of the aforementioned Stephen. Soon he'd become a king himself. Henry II. This was the Plantagenet era. England was about to change. A great factor in this would be Queen Eleanor of Aquitaine. Eleanor was no stereotype maiden in distress locked up in some tower. She was a powerful landowner in her own right. Any king, and it would only be a king, who married her would be creating the ultimate power couple. Louis of France, her first husband, was pious, and this didn't suit ambition. Marriage annulled, Eleanor married King Henry of England. France's lands practically switched sides overnight, causing chaos. In context, this meant that the French territories were suddenly reduced to Ile-de-France around Paris, a fraction of their previous lands. England now had the rest. And brand Plantagenet will still be spoken about in the 21st century, through Tudors, through Shakespeare, to the Victorians, and now. This is where it began. Eleanor and Henry. And neither would be complete without the other. They were legendary. And then, on December the 24th, 1166, a boy, John, was born. In Oxford, England. He would be the last of a long line of children. Eleanor was around 10 years older than Henry. She's in her 40s, he's in his 30s. She had spent over 10 years pregnant and would soon become estranged to royal husband. In addition was Henry's philandering. William Fitzstephen suggests Henry was physically, or at the very least emotionally, abusive to her. He was prone to rage, a Plantagenet trait that would pass to all his sons. Despite the marriage breakdown, politics and image were far more important. After all, they were the power couple, so she acted as his deputy when needed. This was a huge empire. As a side note, I will take the opportunity to introduce a character who will become important over the course of not only John's story, but the period in general. For obvious reasons, Henry was in conflict with various fractured Norman rebels and other dissenters who sided with nearer King Louis of France. The Queen was caught up in this. After all, these were her lands, and her marital choices were controversial. The two men were tearing Normandy apart in a tiff. And here, around 1168, when John was but a pup and still with a wet nurse, his mother Eleanor was in peril. She was travelling across Poitiers, escorted by Earl Patrick and a small escort. All of a sudden, ambushed by Jean de Lusignan and his men, Patrick acted quickly, got the Queen on the fastest horse and sent her to the safety of a nearby castle, but was mortally wounded in the melee. In the skirmish, a dashing young knight, Salisbury's nephew, new in the spurs, just like John, lacking any prospect of inheritance, made his way as a soldier of fortune. William Marshal stood his ground before being eventually wounded and captured. Now, this would compel the Queen to not only pay his ransom, but make him the guardian of the heir, Prince Henry. He fought like a wild boar against dogs. The monarchy now acquired a valuable and loyal asset. John was but a pup, and as a pup his inheritance would be sealed during a peace treaty between the two powerful kings of England and France. Agreement was made, among other things, that rather than leave his vast empire to just one son, Henry, he should divide it between his sons, Henry, Richard, and Geoffrey. Yet because our young pup was destined for the church, he'd receive nothing. Sentier, Lackland. Although, you can see the logic, the three older brothers were growing fast, had survived the trials of childhood, and John was but a baby, he might fall foul of fate like the first son, poor William. As typical of the era, oaths would be broken, controversial deals struck like William of the Scots, but the deal with the lands stuck. John wasn't close to his mother nor his father, as Henry was a king and a statesman, and Eleanor likewise. They had other more important sons, Henry, Richard, and Geoffrey, the eldest a decade older. William had already died in infancy some years earlier. And Eleanor spent a good deal of time at her lands in Poitiers, the capital of Aquitaine. Still with wet nurse, the toddling John, along with his sister Joan, was sent to a monastery in Anjou, Fontevraud. John, being the last of the children, was destined for the life of a priest, an oblate. The abbey was mixed between male and female, though the abbess, the Audeberge, who also later founded Amesbury Prior, ruled the roost. It was a female-dominated environment. As a side note, in 1167, Matilda would pass away in her mid-60s. Although there is no evidence of it, it would be nice to think, given her life in Rouen, that she paid some attention to the young boy, though I doubt it, given her devotion to the church and John's insignificance. During the time leading up to 1170, we come across a string of events. Each of these events will have an impact on John's life. He's less than 5 years old. His older brother Henry is 15, and already hot-tempered. Friction is growing between he and his father, the king. There is already tensions between the king and the Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Becket. The king wants to bring a French custom to the English monarchy, the tradition of crowning the heir apparent, while the current king is still alive. Becket is set against this, but the king gets his way. This is Henry. A short time later, just after Christmas, Becket is famously slain by 4 knights at Canterbury Cathedral. But the point I am making is that Henry, the young king, has been controversially crowned. He is now the young king. Meanwhile, his brother Richard becomes the Duke of Aquitaine. He apparently couldn't give an egg about England. Add to this the Count of Savoy. He has a lack of heirs, and sees an opportunity marrying his daughter Alicia to John. With the king's permission, of course. It's a deal. When the Count of Savoy asks the king about what lands John will inherit, Henry gives Sentier 3 castles, Chinon, Laudon, and Mirabeau, as well as some lands between Italy and Germany, courtesy of Lucia. This ends his destiny as being an oblate in the church. Maybe he has a destiny after all. As an education, he was no doubt taught Latin. As we know, he was an avid reader. He liked chess and music, although probably due to his moulding by the church, was no fan of troubadours or the ways of the courts in Aquitaine. But these 3 castles had belonged to the young king, Henry, which enrages him. He's already not happy about having no real power. His personal seal is even depicted without a sword. And then one day, while on a trip to Chinon in Anjou, just a short ride from Fontevraud, the young king gives his father the slip. He leads the king's men on a right merry chase all across Normandy, through Le Mans, eventually into Paris, and the protection of the French King Louis. At 18, Henry was now allied with the French. Alongside him was his mother Eleanor, his brothers Richard and Geoffrey. Was John? at the tender age of 8, safe from the war and pillage? No, because even in faraway Chinon, his brother Henry was on the warpath laying siege to a castle a few miles away, while Richard was attacking the port of Poitiers unsuccessfully, himself only in his teens. The king himself ends up in Poitiers, dismantling the influence of Eleanor and chiding his older 2 sons. John being the only one loyal, though at 8, what choice did he have? As we are seeing, it was a time of almost permanent conflict, even after the anarchy was fading into distant memory. This war wouldn't last long, and King Henry would prove dominant. John's brothers had just been defeated, along with their allies, and his mother was now a prisoner, alternating between Winchester and Old Sarum. Here she would spend the next 16 years, hardly ever seeing her boys, including her beloved Richard. Such was Henry's wrath. The power couple were over. By 1174, the chaos was over, and the king had John and Joan moved from the Abbey of Fontevraud to England. Possibly Winchester, as we know that his sister Joan, who was 11, is in Winchester getting married, her mother also present. By this time, his schooling would have switched from prayers and a peaceful way of life to more noble requirements like horsemanship, hunting, diplomacy, and the use of armour and weaponry. So, what of Lord John's own marriage to Alicia of Savoy? Unfortunately, the girl seems to have died around this time, which ended any chances of an alliance with Savoy. She had even crossed to England over the Alps and joined the young king at court. Alas, it wasn't to be. Soon after, John is getting betrothed to his cousin Isabella, the daughter of the Earl of Gloucester, and a powerful magnate. All of a sudden, Lackland was in line to inherit quite a lot of land. The 3 castles of Chinon, Laudon and Mirabeau, Nottingham, Marlborough, plus £1,000 a year, which was huge in that day, including what he could get for the lands in Normandy, a substantial sum, but a pittance to the 15k a year that the young King Henry was raking in, his brother. King Henry was still seething from his son's betrayal, their minds poisoned by Eleanor. So maybe it was a good thing that she was so distant to John, as it appears that the king wanted to disinherit the young king, Richard and Geoffrey. The king had already found other women, and may have been thinking of restarting his line. But John's betrothal to Isabel suggests that John may have been his father's favourite. So, in 1177, at the age of 10, John was given the title Lord of Ireland. And so in preparation, Hugh de Lacy, Constable of Chester, along with a young Ranulph de Blondeville, are sent to Ireland. Ranulph himself being a little bit younger than John, and like John, had acquired his lands at a young age. Although Hugh de Lacy seemed to have his own ambition, and before long would lose favour with the old king. Ranulph de Glanville appears in John's life. He was based in Winchester, where John no doubt resided, also acting as guardian of Queen Eleanor when she was taken to be imprisoned in Winchester Castle. John was moving up in the world. Once living with monks and nuns, learning the life of the clergy, and now a lord, learning his place in the royal cause. Ignoring his squabbling brothers, did he see his mother during his time? Most likely. A point of interest. In France, their King Louis had undergone the practice of naming his own son king. Prince Philip was now King Philip, along with his father. Prince Philip is a character who would prove a thorn in John's side for the entirety of his reign. In 1179, King Louis suffers a stroke, passing away soon after, and then passing the crown to his son, the now King Philip. As he left childhood, John never grew to a great height, reaching only 5'6". His hair was dark red, thick and curly. He had a thick-built body, but he was greedy and had a love for wine and gambling. He loved to hunt. His love for the fine foods and clothing came equal to his love of jewels. He was a connoisseur who loved the finer things in life. Bon vivant. He also had a love for women, just like his father. And as he grew into his majority, he would take any woman he saw fancy. He would try to seduce the wife of Eustace the Vesey, causing controversy when it was revealed that a prostitute took her place. At this age, he had a short temper just like his father. Yet, as we mentioned earlier, he had no time for tournaments nor troubadours. He did have a good mind for strategy, but no mind for war. This gave him the name Softsword. His Orgeron rage was legendary. He'd bite his fingers, throw things, signs of his later cruelty already apparent. Tensions and squabbles between the old king and his disloyal sons were continuing even in 1182. The Christmas court was at Cannes. It was huge. Here, young Henry rebelled and Richard and Geoffrey were sent to oppose him, though it looked like a repeat of the rebellion in years previous. Chaos looked inevitable. Battle lines had already been drawn up, and the nobility were already choosing sides. However, Henry the young king falls prey to dysentery and dies soon after. The old king, despite all the squabbling, still loved his son. He was heartbroken, ruined. At first, suspected deceit, but the truth hit him hard. Moreover, the young king had no heirs. He was in his 20s. The old king wanted his remaining sons to put the past behind them, and on the 30th of November, St. Andrew's Day, they all met in Westminster, including Eleanor, united with her sons once again. Richard, Duke of Aquitaine, was now next in line to the throne. He was given his dead brother's lands, and Aquitaine passed to John, only in his mid-teens, while Geoffrey clung on to Brittany. Once again, John's acquisition proved controversial. Richard refused to give up the lands and title, backed by his mother Eleanor, who still legally held the lands. Even in her current predicament, she was going to have one last moment of defiance against the tyrannical king. Further supported by the newly elected Archbishop of Canterbury, Baldwin, the king was forced to concede, though not for long. Again battle lines were drawn, although the old king had no time nor patience. Instead, sends the teenage John to wrest the duchy from Richard. But not only did John lack the manpower to pull off such a feat, the king wasn't prepared to lend him an army. But when Henry orders John to take Aquitaine, did he really mean it? Or was he just venting anger like he did with Thomas Becket? Either way, John invades. It looked like Geoffrey was soon to become the next heir apparent. However, the campaign was a disaster. Instead of meeting his brother head-on, Richard threw his armies into Brittany and laid it to ruin. The fact that Richard vents on Brittany further suggests that he saw the old Geoffrey as the mastermind. Take in mind that Geoffrey, contemporary to his time, was considered slimy and treacherous, much like we see John today. Back then, Geoffrey was the embodiment of wickedness, unlike unfortunate Henry, the young king, who's the embodiment of chivalry. Henry, probably not wanting to lose another son, recalled them all back to England, and by Christmas they're in Windsor. Another chance at peace. Once Christmas was over, Richard was already in Poitiers. John had lost Aquitaine, keeping his previous domain. Effectively, John was now the King of Ireland. The country had managed to remain Celtic for as long as can be remembered, fending off the Romans, the Saxons, the Vikings, and the early Normans. But Henry had other plans, ones of conquest. He had been wearing down the Celts for almost 2 decades. The Anglo-Norman territories were the Pale, and beyond that, lawlessness, at least in the eyes of Henry. Where civilised kingdoms had magnates and barons, the Irish had kings by the dozen. They did have a high king, for all it was worth. Though it appears that John wished to travel to the Holy Land instead of Ireland. King Baldwin of Jerusalem had already become default to leprosy, only in his mid-20s, Baldwin was the only thing keeping peace with Saladin. Several years prior, the then teenage king had utterly beaten Saladin, crushing his armies, although Saladin proved persistent, sort of the battles going back and forth. Saladin was losing the war. His armies halted. When Baldwin's death became imminent, the Patriarch of Jerusalem, Heraclius, arrived in England with an envoy. Jerusalem was about to be offered to Prince John. Remember, the Crusaders held Jerusalem at this point. It was a Christian city. John begged his father to accept, but alas, the answer was no. Maybe Henry saw the inevitable outcome, as Baldwin was fighting the long defeat to both disease and the Saracens. In 1185, Baldwin succumbed to leprosy and died. John, at 18, was then finally knighted at Windsor with pomp and ceremony. He would have been given a cloak and a belted sword, a hard blow from his father, the last blow he had ever received without retaliation. And then, no doubt, a feast and a copious amount of drinking. This was also the year of the 1185 earthquake, by the way, which rocked the Midlands of England. And by rocked, it was 5 on the Richter scale and probably knocked over a few garden gnomes, though Lincoln suffered minor damage and the cathedral was apparently partially collapsed. Just a little point of interest. Then 60 ships landed at Waterford, full of knights and retainers. John had arrived. John was not the best thing that happened to Ireland. Diplomacy wasn't his strong point, and he managed to not just irritate the Irish, but the Anglo-Normans too, who resided there. Don't think for a minute that this was John being John. This was far worse. John wasn't just an impudent teenager. He was a spare who wasn't in line for the throne. In order to achieve that, he would have to see his brother Richard die with no heirs, his brother Geoffrey die with no heirs. He could pretty much get away with anything. So when delegates arrived in Waterford to deal with the new ruler of Ireland, he and his equally young reckless knights would be pulling beards, making fun, pranking, treating the royal court like a frat house. Now, regarding beards, the Irish had full beards, much like we see the classic Celt or Vikings. They were proud. This would have been a great insult. But John did raise 3 castles. They didn't last long, but at least he tried. This disaster lasted just 8 months before King Henry recalled John back to England and installed Jean de Cossey to run things in his stead. The tournament circuit in Normandy was a dangerous affair. Occasionally, stars would emerge, like the famous William Marshall, a legend in his time. Others would not. And on one fateful day, Duke Geoffrey of Brittany was mortally wounded during a jousting accident, unsaddled and trampled by his horse. Now, Roger of Hoveden claims that he succumbed to fever, but this could have also been a part of a jousting accident. And around August the 19th, 1186, the young Geoffrey was dead. He was only 27. Here, the French actually mourned more than the English, and the young man was buried in Notre Dame. The French King Philip was so stricken with grief. The two were best of friends. He had to be restrained from throwing himself into the open tomb. And John spent this time in mourning in Guildford Castle with his father, and there are no sources suggesting Eleanor was present in any of this. Henry was growing older, more tyrannical, more paranoid. His sons, except John, were treacherous, and new arguments were arising in France about the control of Brittany. A new conflict looked on the horizon. Now, did Henry truly trust John? His favourite and only loyal son. In Winchester, we learnt that there was commissioned a painted chamber, but one mural was left to be blank. When the young king, Henry, died, it was completed. It depicted 4 eagles. 3 of them were pecking at the parent, and one waiting for its moment to gouge the eyes. These represented the 4 sons. Even at this point, when John was loyal, the king expected him to afflict him more grievously and perilously than the others. In France, Geoffrey's unborn son was now born, and quarrels occurred over the naming, and the French won. They called him Arthur, after the hero in legend. King Philippe oversaw all of this. Enter Ranulph of Blondeville again, who was now married to Constance of Brittany, the mother of Arthur, the old wife of Geoffrey. This kept the domain firmly, also Henry thought, in English hands. And with politics breaking down again, war was the only foreseeable outcome. A war that would last the best part of 30 years. Once again Richard headed for his friends and allies in France. The two were fast friends. Some writers suggest a homosexual relationship between Richard and Philippe, especially when even the bed did not separate them. But men sharing a bed was regular back in those days, right up until wartime. So why the rumour? Because the knights of Aquitaine would complain that Richard would kidnap wives and make them his whores. So there are two sides to this story. But either way, at the very least, it gives us an insight into how close these two men were. Only another war would help ease this conflict. Horrida Bellum. In 1187, in the east, Saladin rose his banners once more, giving one final try to break the holy city of Jerusalem. He had just crushed the crusading armies at the Battle of Hattin and captured the new king of Jerusalem. And who should this king be? None other than Guy de Lusignan. Remember him? The knight that tried to capture the Queen Eleanor? The one who killed Patrick of Salisbury and ransomed William Marshal? Well, he faced off against Saladin and was utterly defeated. In the aftermath, he is captured by the Saracens, but that isn't the end of the story. Just a fitting dessert for the villain of an old story. But the Holy Land had fallen, after years of holding out to the armies of Saladin. Preachers on every pulpit were decrying the loss of Jerusalem, and soon the words of Innocent III were echoing throughout Europe, and so began the Third Crusade. Richard immediately took the cross and began raising an army to retake Jerusalem from the Saracens. The Duke had tried to secure his inheritance from the king prior to leaving, but Henry was as stubborn and distrustful as ever. Richard would leave for the Holy Land, convinced that the crown would pass to John. Arguments began almost immediately between Henry and Philip, resulting in several skirmishes. But Henry wasn't in the best of health. He wasn't even old by the standards of his time. He was only in his mid-50s. More, he was an old soldier, a war dog. Long time with lance under arm, a career soldier. Many war injuries, aches and pains. He was feeling the toil. He was overweight and in his middle years. He had developed an anal ulcer, which sped to his demise. He even wanted John to marry the promised wife of Richard, ignoring the betrothal to Isabel, though this didn't last long. Not fit for war, Henry's forces were swiftly beaten by Philippe and Richard, forcing him back to Le Mans, where they had to stage a fighting retreat. And here, as Richard was bearing down upon his father's armies, stood William Marshal. Once again, he was fighting to protect a royal. First the Queen, now the King. This time he wouldn't lose. Facing the oncoming troops, clad in full mail, this seasoned veteran donned his helm, lowered his lance, and charged Richard headlong, felling his horse and stalling the advance, allowing the king to fall back to Chinon. Later, when Richard ascended to the throne, William Marshal would give his loyalty, always loyal to the crown, not the person. "You tried to kill me," Richard accuses. "No," says Marshal, "I'm strong enough to aim my lance," was the tactful reply. Chinon would be Henry's last retreat. Here he finally succumbed to his illness. As he was carried on a litter to the castle, more bad news arrived. News he had been expected all along, and a prophecy painted into the murals of Winchester Castle. After long years of loyalty, his favourite son, John, had sided with the King of France and his brother Richard. Destroyed, The defeated king fell into shock. The final blow that would kill him. His prophecy complete.